It's an honor to introduce you to the second part of our series, Preventing Domestic Violence Among People with Disabilities. Today's speaker is Lynn Kelly. Um, Lynn Kelly is the coordinator of professional training for Women Aware, the leading comprehensive domestic violence agency in Middlesex County, New Jersey. Lynn has a master's degree in counseling and has worked in the field of domestic violence for 10 years. She is passionate about bringing awareness of the implications of domestic violence to the community, especially to the youth. Lynn Kelly will cover the first steps to reaching out. She will also discuss and identify the systemic and organizational and personal barriers survivors with disabilities face. So I would like to thank you all for being here. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes for making this work. Special thanks to Callan in our office. And Lynn, I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Roxanne. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Lynn Kelly, and I apologize to everyone for my camera not being able to, not working, and we're having some technical difficulties, but it is my pleasure to bring this information to you. So I will get started on the first steps to reaching out. We'll go to our next slide, which is the goals for the participants. I would like you all to come away with these following bits of information. The first, to gain an understanding of the individual barriers a survivor with a disability may face, to challenge the assumptions advocates may have about a survivor with a disability, and to strengthen and increase safety planning strategies to survivors with a disability. Next slide. Barriers to seeking help. There are several barriers that a survivor with a disability may face, and the next few slides we're going to look at those. But as you look at these slides, please keep in mind your own workplace or someone that you may know that is a survivor with a disability, so that you can, as well, when you're looking forward, moving forward in the work that you're doing, be able to help this person with these examples in mind. So the first, there are a few accessible resources. Many of the safe houses or counseling programs, they may not have ramps. They may not have bathrooms with sinks that are low enough for someone that is using a wheelchair to assess. There may not be toilets that are low enough. There may not be communication devices because people with certain disabilities communicate differently than we do. Interpretation devices may not be available. Braille literature is most often missing when you're looking at literature on domestic violence, even in domestic violence agencies. Transitional houses and safe houses may not be accessible to the survivor. Societal stigma and stereotypes towards survivors with disabilities, such as some equating the disability with the lack of intelligence and ability. Stigma is huge in our society. When we look at someone with a disability, we immediately see that disability and forget that this is a human being with intelligence. We forget that this person has abilities, and we think that we need to talk to that person or treat that person in a different way. Next slide. Again, barriers to seeking help. There may be the fear of loss of independence. There may be financial dependence on the abuser. And I decided to look up some statistics, and this particular one was shared with me by someone that works for our national coalition in New Jersey. 70% of people with disabilities are unemployed. So keeping that statistic in mind when you're working with a survivor that has a disability, they may or may not be employed. So just the thought of leaving that household where they're dependent on the abuser or the caretaker financially would be a huge step. Who's going to take care of me? Who's going to feed me? Is going through that person's mind. Next bullet, if the survivor has a hidden disability, helpers may not believe she or he needs help. Now, there are several hidden disabilities. One, someone may not be completely blind. They may have a visual impairment. They may have vision, but not appear to have a disability. So keep that in mind as well. Often seen and spoken of in terms of their symptoms or diagnosis, thus objectifying them. Again, if you see someone in a wheelchair, that person becomes the person in the wheelchair, and everything else about that person is lost. Next slide. Barriers to seeking help. Survivor may be heavily dependent on the abusive primary caretaker and runs the risk of losing their caretaker if they report abuse. Survivors, period, don't report the abuse. It is one of the most underreported crimes. So someone that may have a disability runs that risk of losing that person even more so. They do it at a cost. Attitudinal barriers such as policies of the safe house. This is very important to understand. Policies are in place to screen people in, not to screen people out. So you don't want the survivor to worry about whether their service animal is going to be allowed to come into the safe house or the transitional house or the counseling program. You don't want the survivor to worry about their personal aid. If they're using a personal aid and they need to go into the safe house for safety reasons, will that aid be allowed to come as well? Who is going to help me if the aid cannot come? If you have a mental illness, many programs require that person to be in a day program. There are so many people with mental illnesses that aren't in a day program and they function just fine. So these are just 3 additional barriers, attitudinal barriers that survivor has to think about. So what I would ask is that there be policies in place already. Get familiar with your state laws on people with disabilities. Make sure that these policies are in place before the survivor with a disability comes to your doors. Next slide. Systematic barriers are also important to think about, and I would like you to think about them in these 4 ways. They are ongoing. They are built into the daily working life of the organization, community, or society. They are not obvious to able-bodied people, and they appear to be rational and necessary. And again, I want you, all the participants, to think about or consider the barriers a survivor may face, again, in your own workplace as we look at the next few slides. Next slide. Systematic barriers to consider. Advocates may show embarrassment, pity, or uncertainty about how to offer assistance. Advocates may assume that the survivors are not parents or do not have parenting skills. Advocates may assume survivors cannot be independent. So if you are working with a survivor, the only way you are going to be able to answer or know anything about them is to ask questions. Ask if they need assistance or if your assistance is needed in any kind of way. They will let you know. Be careful not to assume that because the victim has a disability, that they cannot parent. They've been doing it thus far without you or anyone else's help. They already know, and their children understand their disability. They already have this common bond between them. So again, ask questions before jumping in. Next slide. Advocates may have difficulty making eye contact or may speak louder or slowly if the person is deaf, blind, developmentally disabled, or mentally ill. Again, you are talking to a human being. Make eye contact with them so that they understand that you are addressing them. Even if that person is blind, they can feel that you're looking at them. It is respectful to make eye contact. Do not talk any louder because you may believe that that person is deaf or hearing impaired, and do not talk slower. Advocates should ask one question at a time. If there is a slow response, do not ask another question or switch words around. This can be very confusing to the survivor. Again, be patient, be respectful, and treat that person like you would any other survivor. Next slide. Systematic barriers continued. Advocates may speak to personal aid or family member instead of speaking directly to the survivor. Advocates may feel awkward when using expressions such as, "Do you see what I mean?" Someone that's visually impaired or blind uses the same language. And we're raised that way. So again, you want to speak to this survivor the same as you would any other survivor. Advocates may show frustration, anger, or irritation when a survivor with a disability is being interviewed and does not understand questions. I can't stress it enough to be patient, be respectful, and to be kind. The survivor wants to get their story out. They want the advocates or anyone else that is listening to listen, to actively listen, and to hear their story, believe their story, validate their story. Next slide. Systematic barriers continued. Advocates don't always have the proper training to distinguish between disabilities or to advocate properly. 35% of safe houses surveyed offer disability awareness trainings to their staff. It is imperative that there is ongoing training with safe house staff, with counseling staff, anyone that is working with a survivor to be properly trained. Our coalition, New Jersey's Coalition for Battered Women, we offer ongoing training on victims with disabilities. If you can't find one within your own state, maybe college campuses offer it, but seek that training. It would only help you to better serve all of your clients. Advocates need to be sensitive to how the survivor may communicate. Everyone communicates differently, but it is really important to understand that many of us talk with gestures. 65% of communication is nonverbal. So being able to understand how someone communicates, it may be differently than the way you communicate, but it's the best way that this person can. So again, be patient and be respectful and sensitive to how that person communicates. They may not remember every detail. Someone may have had a stroke, and it's caused them, to have short-term memory loss. They may state the facts, out of order, trying to recall details of their experience. They may appear confused to you because of that. So again, listen, actively listen, and be patient. Next slide. Identifying barriers to autonomy and safety. The advocate should ask the survivor about the physical and attitudinal barriers affecting her safety. The advocate should ask about possible disability issues that may impact safety planning strategies. It is imperative to do safety planning with all survivors. You may have to safety plan a little different with someone with a disability. And there are questions that you need to consider when safety planning with someone that has a disability. In yesterday's session, we learned the different types of abuse that someone that has a disability may experience. So you want to consider those disability issues when safety planning. Some of those questions that you may need to ask: how does your abuser react to your disability in private and in public? Are they using your disability to humiliate you? How does your abuser tell others of your disability? Does your abuser do things to make your disability worse? So those are just some things to consider when safety planning. We use the Jill Davies safety planning model when planning with each individual survivor. Use the same model, but keeping in mind that the disability is important when safety planning. You also need to include the children or child if the survivor has children when safety planning. You need to look at the life-generated risk. You need to look at the community-generated risk, and you also need to look at the abuser-generated risk when safety planning. Next slide. Creating safety planning strategies. The advocate should ask about and incorporate the practical ways a person with a disability successfully navigates barriers. The advocate should also consider including support services the survivor wants to use in the safety planning process, like their friends, their personal assistant, or a disability advocate. What the survivor has been doing so far to survive also needs to be considered. They're in front of you, so they've learned to navigate through the violence in that relationship. You want to focus on the survivor's strengths. You need to include the survivor in the safety planning strategy. It is imperative that they are included. Next slide. Organizational support for safety planning. Advocates should provide sufficient time to support individualized safety planning for survivors with disabilities. This is really important to set aside time. You don't want 5 minutes, or 10, 15 minutes. You may need an hour. You may need it more than an hour. Again, it's depending on the survivor's disability and how they communicate and their lives. What's going on that may need to be included. Safety planning materials should be presented in a clear, concise language, and materials should be available in alternate formats. Safety plans should be reviewed and updated periodically as the survivor's situation changes. It goes across the board, regardless of who that survivor is. We need to look at those safety plans on an ongoing basis. For whatever reason, abusers seem to make contact whenever they can, however they can. It's just something that they do, and we never know how they're going to do it. They may make contact through the children. It just all depends. So reviewing that safety plan to see how it may need to be updated is key to helping the survivor continue to survive. Next slide. Safety planning process. Advocates should be aware of their own and others' assumptions about a survivor's abilities and strengths. Advocates, whenever possible, should develop safety plans in person, allowing for time to understand complicated choices while respecting the pace of communication and needs of the survivor. I am repeating that here because it is so imperative for us to really take the time to safety plan with our clients. Again, depending on where you may work, if you're a caretaker, an advocate in a domestic violence agency or a counseling program, if you're working with a survivor with a disability, please take that time to do a safety plan with them in person. Again, body language, body gestures. We talk with our eyebrows. We talk with our hands. So many messages could be lost if we're doing this over the phone. So please take that time to do it in person. Next slide. Steps to helping. Advocates need to understand that they may not be accepted by the survivor. There's a huge trust factor here. You need to develop the trust with all of your survivors. The survivor with a disability is no different, but because this is going to the next bullet, the survivor may be accustomed to everyone else thinking that they know what is best for them. The advocate falls under that everyone. So again, they're thinking that, okay, here we go, another person that's going to tell me what to do with my life. So make sure that you get to know that person, gain their trust, validate their story, validate their experience, believe their experience, and so that you can better help that person and they understand that you are there to do just that. The survivor may be accustomed to everyone else thinking that they know what is best for them. The survivor knows their disability better than anyone else, so they have to be included. Advocates must look beyond the disability. Equal treatment does not mean similar treatment. Again, a survivor is a survivor. You want to help that person regardless. Equal treatment does not mean similar treatment. You are providing the same help, but in a different way, because again, you have to think about that person's disability. Steps to helping. Be respectful and be patient. Remember, agencies are in place to help survivors of domestic violence regardless of their age, race, gender, religion, cultural background, economic status, level of education, or ability. We all have abilities. They just may be a little different. And that's okay. In the state of New Jersey, we have 23 sister agencies that fall under the National Coalition of Domestic Violence. On the next slide, you can click on our website, www.njcbw.org, to get the listings of all the domestic violence agencies. Women Aware's hotline number is listed on the top of the slide. If you are in another state, every state in the United States has a domestic violence agency. If you are able to, or your caretaker is able to, go online and put in the national coalition of your state, they will be able to give you each county's listing of where the domestic violence agency is. The information that I've shared with you hopefully will be that first step to a survivor reaching out and knowing where to reach out, and also knowing that advocates are doing their best to be helpful and to give you the best options available if you are a survivor. Thank you. I don't know, Roxanne, if there are any questions that I may be able to answer.
We don't have any questions that are posted, so I'm going to ask you, is there any final message you'd like to share?
I guess the biggest thing for me as someone with a hidden disability, people forget about us, and I am a survivor as well, and we honestly are forgotten about it, and this is across the board with DV agencies and just people in general. We have target populations. I'll use our agency for an example. In Middlesex County, we have a huge Latina and South Asian population, and we work really hard to address the needs of those clients. And if I could stress to everyone, listening, that a survivor with a disability is another population that will fall through the cracks if we really all don't become an inclusive agency, having the literature, having whatever communication aids, having, people just think about ramps. They think about the doors being wide, and that's it. There are several disabilities, so, get proper training. Make sure, if any directors or supervisors are listening, make sure your staff is properly trained. They aren't going to know every single, thing about it, every disability. There are several, but to have, just some knowledge, some understanding, to be sensitive is really, really important.
Right. I agree. I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your information, and for being who you are, and for all the work that you do on a daily basis, yourself and your organization.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our interpreter who's here today. And Lynn, thank you for being part of this series. It's very helpful information, and we greatly appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to be a part. And again,
Thank you.
I'm sorry for the technical difficulties we've had.
No, you went on fine now, so it's great. And thank you to anyone who's logged in from wherever you are. We hope that this information touches your life and helps you and empowers you. So thank you for being here and for taking the time to join us.